the scene. He's got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello, everybody. There was a time, it was about 20 years ago, where all we ever heard about was something called microfinance. It was what my guest today called the IT development program, in a sense, I guess, equivalent to the fashion of cryptocurrency today. It was driven in part by Muhammad Yunus, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2006 for founding a microfinance bank and pioneering the concept, and also driven its popularity by startups like Kiva. But my guest today, Mara Kardas-Nelson, has another story of microfinance. She has a new book out, We Are Not Able to Live in the Sky, The Seductive Promise of Microfinance. It's an expose of the unintended consequences of this technology and financial movement. She's joining us from just outside Boston. Mara, congratulations on the new book. Where do we begin the story of microfinance? What year does it originate?
So it's a more complicated question than you might think. So the story that most of us will have heard, if we've heard of microfinance at all, is that Muhammad Yunus in the 1970s, who's a Bangladeshi economist, had been trained in the US and moved back to Bangladesh just as the country was coming to fruition. It had just gained independence from Pakistan, and came across a group of poor women who were taking out high-price loans from the people that they were getting inputs from. So borrowing from the same people that they were taking things like bamboo and other things from, and then paying those people back at the end of the day at very high rates. And Muhammad Yunus looked at this and said, this is an absurd system. These women are being exploited. All they need is a little bit of capital, and they'll be able to launch themselves out of poverty. And that, as I said, that was in the mid 1970s. And then the bank he founded, the Grameen Bank, was founded in 1983. And so that's the story that most of us know. As I go into the book, it's actually more complicated. So there's a much longer history of small anti-poverty lending reaching back many centuries, and sometimes done by poor people themselves, with savings and lending groups being instituted by poor people among one another. But there's a whole other history, including of credit unions as well there. At the same time, in the 1970s, just as Muhammad Yunus had come across this group of borrowers, this famous story we now know, there were a lot of other people who were tinkering with small loans with the idea that these, again, could be used to help people, and particularly women, launch themselves out of poverty. And so there are a couple of people that I trace in the book, three of whom are American, and one who is Indian, who were tinkering with this idea around the same time. They don't have the same recognition that Muhammad Yunus does. They didn't win a Grameen or a Nobel Prize, but they really were there at the beginning, and they were also really instrumental in helping to generate this idea that the loans would specifically be for women, that they should be targeted towards women, and were really influential in getting big donors, particularly American donors like USAID and the World Bank, on board. So even though Yunus takes the credit, so to speak, there were a lot of other people who were working on this around the same time. And microfinance really hit kind of fever pitch and became extremely popular around the late 1990s, early 2000s. And so that's when we started to see before the Nobel Peace Prize, of course, but a lot of politicians, celebrities really come on board. I was in college from 2004 to 2008 studying international relations and focusing a lot on international development and international finance, and microfinance was embedded in the courses that I was taking. So around the mid-2000s, it was really seen as you said, as the anti-poverty program.
Perhaps I'm a bit of a cynic. I'm certainly a cynic. I've written my own books trying to expose some of the truths of the digital revolution. But I have to admit that I'm not surprised with your book about the subtitle, The Seductive Promise of Microfinance. I remember at the time, it always, not that I knew that much about it, but it always sounded a little too good to be true. Is that unfairly cynical, Mara?
The short answer I would say is no. I mean, the way I think about this too is that if something is too good to be true, particularly something as complicated as launching someone out of poverty. I mean, people are impoverished for a multitude of reasons, particularly in very poor countries like Bangladesh and like Sierra Leone, which I focus on in the book. There's a myriad of factors that have to do with historical factors, structural factors as to why an individual is poor. And so to just assume that something as simple as a loan, particularly a very small loan, I mean, we're talking about sometimes $20, $30, $40, sometimes $100, $200, regardless small, that could be used to launch themselves out of poverty. I think it is too good to be true. I think what is surprising to me and what was surprising to me in doing this research is how, it seems to you and I kind of obvious that such a premise might be flawed, particularly, as I said, when you have small loans and when those loans in particular are coupled with quite high interest rates. And so the interest rates that I found in the book are anywhere from 0% to 250% annual. And so you're asking someone to pay that back and take care of their business and their families and get above the poverty line. That seems like quite a big ask. And so I think I don't think it's too cynical. I think the real question there is, why is this story that seems too good to be true? Why did it take off? Why was it so appealing to not only Western funders, but celebrities, politicians? I mean, Bill Clinton was a major supporter. Barack Obama was a supporter. Why even in the face of kind of this obvious potential problem therein of getting poor people into debt, why did it still take off as kind of the number one development intervention for so many decades? And that's what I really tried to explore in the book, is what was it about this narrative that was so appealing, particularly to Western funders, and what were kind of the political and economic enabling factors at the time, particularly the 70s, 80s, and 90s, that allowed this to become the anti-poverty intervention of the day.
He won, Yunus won the Nobel Prize. He could be an invention of a satirical fiction writer. Of course, he was very popular on the TED circuit. What does his popularity and the ease with which the promise of microfinance seduced progressives in the West, what does it tell us about that world, Mara?
I think Muhammad Yunus was ultimately, he's still alive, is ultimately a very good storyteller. That is the core to what made his particular mode of microfinance.
I'm jumping in here.
Yeah.
I don't mean to interrupt. Storyteller or fabricator?
I think both in a way. I think Muhammad Yunus is a blind optimist. He's extremely optimistic and still remains so to this day. If you read what he speaks about with social business, for example, he still really believes in the notion of a win-win solution in which poverty can be solved at the same time that someone can make a profit. And he really, I mean, I read every book that he wrote. I read his PhD dissertation. This sort of optimism is there throughout. And I think it is really true to who he is. I think there is a blindness that comes with that, or a willingness to not see. I think Muhammad Yunus is obviously a very intelligent person. But I think there was a willingness to not see some of these contradictions in order for the story to sell, and because he was getting so much positive feedback. I mean, I think that was something that I saw in the book as well, is that as the story kind of picked up steam of, a single loan being able to launch someone out of poverty, it went from being a story or a hope to a fact, right? Something that is true, as opposed to something that someone hopes could be true. And so I think Eunice really leaned into other people believing that to be true. I mean, we like to believe good stories, and we, particularly here in the West, are excited about the notion of, something far away being solved by something we can do here.
Which doesn't cost us too much, which doesn't involve a lot of pain or structural reform.
Right. It doesn't. Right. It requires maybe $50, if that, and doesn't. And the promise of Kiva, which you talked about at the beginning, is make a loan, change a life. That with a few clicks, you can suddenly launch someone out of poverty. You can do it over breakfast. Look through kind of a Rolodex of borrowers, pick a borrower, and then by the time you finish breakfast, change someone's life. And I think that's a really captivating narrative.
Gym, right?
Before you go to the gym or on the way to the gym, I mean, with a phone, literally you can scroll through these people
while you're posting your social media on it.
Right.
Did you get an opportunity to talk to Eunice for this book? Did you?
Yeah. So I wrote to Eunice several times. He emailed back and said that he wasn't interested in being interviewed, that he felt that this topic had been covered a lot, and so didn't want to be interviewed. He said to me, let me know if you have any questions. And I did write those to him and did not hear back. What he did say was, I really encourage you to, as much as possible, look for written documents. So don't just interview, people like myself who are historically involved in microfinance, but look for written documents instead. And I did that. So I looked at Grameen documents dating back from the 1980s, other documents from major microfinance institutions from the 70s onwards, and also USAID and other funders' documents. So I took that to heart. In addition to, this is kind of, an oral history as well of those major microfinance advocates from the 1970s onwards.
Is there a sense now about what was, as you say, the IT development program of the 90s or the early 2000s? Is there a sense of failure about it? Where are we with microfinance in 2024?
Yeah, it's a good question. So you'll hear it's a more complicated answer than just it failed and we've moved on. So the reason that I wrote this book is I was living in Sierra Leone, West Africa, and from 2015 to 2018. And over lunch, I had a discussion with a colleague who had worked in a legal aid program. And she mentioned that some of the people, the women in particular, that she had helped were in jail or in the police because of debt, and including microfinance debt. And so my immediate question was, I can't believe people are in jail for that, but also, oh my God, microfinance still exists, right? It's something that we had heard so much about. And then the narrative kind of went quiet, particularly, at least among the circles that I was in here in the US. And so I think, the narrative you often hear if you talk to economists here or people who are involved in microfinance here, like those included in the book, was microfinance didn't work. It became too commercialized. We've moved on. We recognize that there have been a lot of lessons learned, et cetera, et cetera. But hundreds of millions of people around the world are still impacted by microfinance loans. I think it's too clean and too easy to say it's done, because it's not done for those people. The women that I met in Sierra Leone and that I profile in the book are paying anywhere from 40 to 50% interest rates a year and still taking out these loans to get by. And so to say, oh, that was a mistake, whoops, we've moved on, completely negates their experiences. And that's part of what I wanted to do in the book, is kind of look at the aftermath of an idea. While those of us here who, are not having to deal with these loans on a day-to-day life, it's easy for us to say, whoops, let's just forget about it, or, let's move on and try something new. For people who are actually contending with this debt, it still has a real impact on their lives and the lives of those around them. And then I would also say that microfinance here in the West has undergone a rebranding. So again, if you speak to people who are involved in microfinance, they say, yes, we realize that high price credit is a problem. What we do instead now is something called financial inclusion, which is essentially a rebranding of, in my view, of microfinance, in which we're not only offering poor people debt, but we're also offering them things like bank accounts, mobile money, etc. Those things can have a measurable and sometimes positive impact on a poor person's life, but they still don't get at the underlying issues of why someone is poor, right? This core question of the structural reasons that someone is poor are still negated, or we're at least blind to them. At the same time, those who are sponsoring financial inclusion, including organizations like MasterCard and others, they have real financial benefit here. They're expanding their customer base in
and
countries
presumably
like
making a lot of money as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's there. We're talking about if you were to quote unquote financially include the 1 billion people who are currently unbanked, that's 1 billion customers, right? And these are high priced products to poor people because they're seen as risky. And so we have to look also at who benefits, not only potentially of the person who's financially included, but also those who are promoting these products to those who are quote unquote now financially included. I think it really runs the risk of, as microfinance did, kind of sugarcoating what could potentially be, again, a kind of very limited financial solution, one that isn't a solution necessarily, or is only partially a solution, and one also that can push someone further into debt. So just because a loan is given by a mobile phone, that doesn't necessarily make it a better loan, right? The only thing that's different is now that it's given online. It's still potentially very high price. Someone's still getting in debt because of it. So I think this rebranding should be taken with a healthy amount of skepticism as well.
Words matter, and a lot of the things you're talking about, you're describing in euphemistic language. Probably privately, you might use other words. What about Yunus himself? In your book, you describe him, perhaps again euphemistically, as an American-trained Bangladeshi economist. Does that suggest perhaps that there may be a problem with his approach to economics, or is that just a throwaway remark?
I think what I meant there is that part of what made him so captivating to people like Bill Clinton and others is that I think he was able to be both foreign and American, right? So he spoke perfect English. He was trained in American institutions. He was trained on a Fulbright in particular. So he was able to kind of operate in the Western system and in Western capitalism specifically, and use language that, a banker here would understand. And at the same time, he appeared foreign, right? He wore Bangladeshi clothes. And I think it offered for someone who was interested in this notion of, melding these two worlds to have a single solution to poverty, one that's, as we said, kind of simplistic and easy, and kind of this kumbaya moment of all of us coming together.
I'm guessing also that it fitted very comfortably with the Clinton-Blair third way ideology of doing good and making money at the same time.
Right. It also, I go into detail in the book about when Clinton and Yunus first met, or the story that's told about when they first met. And, Clinton, when he was running for president, really campaigned on this idea of needing an alternative economy, right? So one that specifically wasn't didn't allow poor people to just rely on the state, on welfare. And he was kind of concerned that that made people lazy, et cetera, et cetera. We often attribute that language to Reagan, but Clinton really pushed that as well. And so he was really taken by this notion that microfinance, even here in the U.S., would, allow a poor person to take care of their own problems, and in so doing unburden government programs. And of course, Clinton was responsible for really diminishing welfare once he was president. And so this was, again, these are things that often, particularly in progressive circles, we associate with Ronald Reagan, but Clinton really bought into those ideas as well. And then, as you say, more recently during his presidency, and more particularly more recently after he was president, this notion notion of kind of doing good while doing well, right? Being able to have social business, a business that both makes profit and does good for the world. That's something that Eunice has really pitched. And even though Eunice at this point says, oh, microfinance has gone too upmarket, I'm concerned about the interest rates that I'm seeing, I don't agree with the current system, he still really pushes the idea of social business. That core idea of doing good while doing well is still really core to who Eunice is and what he pitches as a solution to poverty.
And I assume that the effective altruists also are in some ways, or that ideology is a legacy of this thinking. Sam Bankman-Fried isn't around, of course, these days. At least he's not in society itself. He's behind bars. But I'm guessing that Sam Bankman-Fried would have liked this kind of idea.
Yeah, I think that the effective altruists really come from that. Muhammad Yunus kind of was the OG effective altruist, essentially. I mean, he really kind of paved the way for this to be a tangible idea. I mean, other people, of course, were talking about this, and I talk about that in the book, kind of, again, as I spoke about the political ideologies that were coming up as Yunus was coming up, that made him so popular. But he was able to distill it into, a sentence or two, which is that you can make profit and you can launch someone out of poverty at the same time. And he made that an idea that hundreds of millions of people understand.
And Mara, we forgot to add, you can live forever and be rich and happy.
Right.
And
right.
Eunice cannot be.
We can't blame Eunice for that, but we can blame Eunice for, again, this idea of kind of a perfect world done through simplistic means, right? Without actually looking at the complicated, sticky stuff, and without looking at if someone is winning quite a lot, making a lot of money, like what are the impacts of that? And so I do think he paved the way for some of these movements that we see now.
Yeah, and that language we always used to, or we still hear at conferences like TED, are described as win-win. We're talking to Mara Kardas-Nelson, the author, I think, of an important new book, We Are Not Able to Live in the Sky, a history, a rather, I think, revealing history of the microfinance movement. I want to thank our friends at Liberties Quarterly for getting us such great guests as Mara Kardas-Nelson, having the opportunity to talk about these important subjects. Going to run the Liberties also does great work in important and sometimes overlooked cultural, economic, political, social subjects. Going to run a short feature on Liberties, and then we'll be back with Mara to talk more about what we can learn from perhaps the failure of microfinance. We'll be back in a second.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with Mara Kardas-Nelson, the author of We Are Not Able to Live in the Sky. Mara, it's a wonderful title. Explain what you mean by it.
Yeah, so it actually comes from a Cambodian borrower who was speaking to a human rights organization in Cambodia called Lakado. And he was describing the lengths to which he's going to pay off his microfinance debt. So Cambodia has one of the most saturated microfinance markets in the world, and extremely over-indebted borrowers. People taking out multiple loans, several $1,000s per loan, and paying about 30% per loan, depending on the fees that are included in the loan. And so this borrower is speaking to this human rights organization about the lengths to which he's going to pay off the debt. And he is considering selling his family's land. And he says, we are not able to live in the sky. If we sell our land, we have nothing nothing left. I'm paraphrasing there. And that really, that stuck with me for so many reasons. I mean, just obviously the tangible impact of these debt repayments, and what it means not only for that borrower, but for his family. I mean, this is generational land. This is essentially his family's wealth that he's considering having to sell in order to pay off the debt. But also this notion of how almost inhuman it would be to do that, right? It's this notion of, we can't live in the sky. We're human just like you. What we need, things that you need. We need land, we need water, we need a daily subsistence. And so this notion of, what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to kind of take this other existence. It's not possible. And it really stuck with me. I also, I think is important. Cambodia is a really important microfinance story because it is seen as a success story among microfinance advocates because it is so saturated. So this notion of, wow, the microfinance market really took off there. It did really take off there. It also means that millions of Cambodians are in debt. And there's been a lot of documentation, not only by human rights organizations like Lakato, but news organizations as well, like Reuters and Bloomberg, of the link between land loss and this over-indebted borrowers. And so we're seeing the after effects of so much debt for those borrowers themselves.
Very tragic unintended consequences, both
absolutely
and socially. How much did you travel? This is not an academic book. It's a work of journalism. You write for a lot of different publications. How many countries did you go to research this book?
So I had planned to go to Bangladesh, India, and Cambodia. I wrote this during COVID, and so that made it quite difficult. Cambodia in particular had a really severe COVID lockdown, and so I wasn't able to go. What I did instead was I reported from Sierra Leone, West Africa from 2019 to 2022, and followed two groups of borrowers, one in Freetown, the capital, one in Kono in the eastern part of the country, an area that's historically associated with diamond mining, and followed two groups of borrowers there. And as I said, I followed them for about 3 years, and then a year when I came back just through WhatsApp voice memos and things like that, which was a really helpful reporting tool to see what the kind of the legacy of the debt, with first of all, their kind of day-to-day dealing with the debt, but also how the debt impacted them and their families over several years. And so that's really the focus of the book. But I also look at how microfinance is played out in other places, including Mexico, India, and Cambodia. And that was through interviews with people who have worked there. And as Muhammad Yunus suggested, through reading other people's work as much as possible and looking at what had been documented.
Mara, you're not an anthropologist, but the thing that occurs to me is, were there structures historically in these communities, in these rural communities, that enabled borrowing, small-scale borrowing, maybe within families or within tribes and networks? Did this ever exist, or was this idea of microfinance, of small loans to poor farmers, was it really as revolutionary as it was presented?
Yeah, so in West Africa, where the book focuses, there's something called osusus, or sometimes they're called susus. And so they are small-scale lending and borrowing groups that people do together. So it's maybe a group of 10 people, for example. Everyone gives $10, and then that money is given out to everyone in the group. So $100 to this person first, then the next person, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And those are extremely popular within Sierra Leone. Every microfinance borrower that I met, and actually almost every person that I met, uses an osusu, and they use them. They're seen as again, both a savings and lending group. So it allows someone to put aside $10 and get $100 back in, a matter of weeks or months, depending on the cycle of the Osusu, which allows them to compile much more money than they would necessarily be able to otherwise. And these, as far as I was able to see, go back to at least the mid-19th century, or that's when they were first documented. There's suggestion that they potentially go back even further than that. And these sort of groups have been documented all over the world for centuries. So the short answer to your question is no, this is not a new idea. And some of those, the main tenets of Osusus or other lending and borrowing groups are really the same that we see in microfinance. There's even been some suggestion from academics that Muhammad Yunus may have heavily gleaned from these saving and lending groups in order to come up with the idea of microfinance. I wasn't able to confirm or deny whether that's true, but there has been, I mean, the similarities, I will say, are quite remarkable between the two.
Well, innovators are also, by definition, they borrow ideas. Some people might even say steal them. I'm not sure that necessarily is a critique of Yunus, but it's interesting. We've done some shows, Mara, on why the 90s matter. You're presenting another perspective on why the 90s matter in terms of a critique of Clinton's third way. Was this also, this popularity of microfinance, was it a way of bringing a lot of, for better or worse, often for worse, a way of bringing these rural communities in Africa and in other poorer parts of the world into a global economy? So was this part of globalization?
Yeah, so particularly earlier, actually, than the 1990s and in the 70s and 80s, the idea that microfinance and its precursors, such as credit unions and even these savings and lending groups, could kind of act as a soft tool to encourage communities to take up capitalism, or at least kind of capitalistic ideas, was pitted, and including by USAID and the Peace Corps and others, really saw particularly credit unions as essentially a way to encourage individuals and communities to take up the same sort of notions that we have here about the importance of saving and borrowing. And that, again, reaches even further back. If you look at other modes of kind of similar versions of microfinance historically, there's a lot that's been written on how that was used in communities around the world to encourage them to take up kind of very specific capitalist notions. And particularly after the Soviet Union broke apart, again, the US government through USAID and others saw microfinance as a way to instill individual first capitalistic ideas in the former Soviet bloc. And so we saw former Soviet countries really become inundated with microfinance companies, with the idea that, first of all, those microfinance companies could offer a product to an individual that had been denied under Soviet rule, but also, again, that this would act as kind of a carrot to encourage individuals, their communities, and their countries ultimately to kind of follow the Western way.
You said you didn't talk to Muhammad Yunus for the book. I certainly didn't invite him for the show, and had I, I'm sure he wouldn't have come on. But if he was here, perhaps there's a couple of responses to your critique. The first is the standard capitalist one, Mara. Well, these people took out their loans. They could have read the terms, and no one was forcing them to take these loans, and they had to pay them back in the same way as people in the West take out credit card loans and have to pay those back. How would you respond to that critique?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of answers there. One is that the notion that they've been told the terms, that's often actually not true. With the microfinance borrowers that I met in Sierra Leone, many of them were illiterate or not fully literate. And so being given a 10-page document of terms was not particularly helpful. And when they were told orally through loan officers the terms, I was there often, and they were not told the full term. So they were told the lowest interest rate, but they weren't told what the annualized interest rate was. They also weren't told hidden fees. And so I think that in and of itself, that's kind of a small part of the answer, but an important one as well. The notion that these terms are clear and transparent and readily accessible is not always true.
Well, that sounds not unlike Western credit cards, the MasterCards and Visas of the world. They play similar games. The other critique, Mara, a bigger one, is, and correct me if I'm wrong, from what you've been saying, you don't believe that microfinance addresses the structural foundations of economic inequality and injustice, which I'm sure is true. But on the other hand, those structural foundations are so deep. They require so many political, economic, cultural resources. They require perhaps a revolution. So at least this is better than nothing. How would you respond to that observation?
I think the notion that it's better than nothing does a real disservice to poorer people. So it's a notion that, you're poor, you can deal with it, essentially. That's what we say to poor people in the US when they take out payday loans, again, at, sometimes 180, 200% annual interest rate. Well, too bad, it's what you got. It's better than nothing. And I think that we can do better than that. I think that that's lazy. I think it's ideologically lazy. I think it's intellectually lazy. And I think that we can do better than that. I think it's more creative to do better than that. There are very specific things that can be done. For example, in a place like Sierra Leone, there are actually more money leaves through illicit funds than is given to the country in loans and donations from the likes of World Bank, USAID, and others. And so the notion of, there's nothing that can be done. There's some very specific fixes that can be done there. What I think the real problem with microfinance is, of course, structural solutions take a long time and are as you said, structural problems are extremely deep and go sometimes centuries back. As I said, I don't think that's a reason not to fix them. And there are some very specific things that can be done. What microfinance did, I think, was to not only not solve those structural solutions, but to distract from them. And I think that, in a way, is almost the most harmful part. The notion that through Kiva you can give a loan, change a life. It really distracted from conversations that we could have been having for 50 years at this point about if we really do want to tackle poverty, particularly in very poor countries like Sierra Leone, what is it really going to take? It's not going to be fixed in 5 minutes. It probably won't be fixed in a generation. That doesn't mean it can't be done. And I think that with microfinance, it made it too easy to just to completely be blind to those structural problems and really offered kind of a salve for both us here in the West to say, oh, something is being done, and a way for people to take debt to get by in other countries without actually dealing with the underlying problems. And I think, in a way, that's the bigger long-term legacy of microfinance, is how distracting it ultimately is from these larger conversations that I think we need to have.
And do you see the painless, simplified utopianism of microfinance? Is it playing out now with cryptocurrency and with AI? Do you hear the same languages? We did a show on a Bulgarian crypto queen who ripped off millions of people for billions of dollars. And I didn't actually realize someone wrote a book about it. They came on the show. The damage this woman did in Africa was astonishing. Is cryptocurrency, in a sense, the second or third chapter in the microfinance story? This painless utopianism, financial engineering, a lot of fast talk and techno gobbledygook that actually doesn't change anything.
So I'll start by saying that I'm certainly not an expert on crypto. What I will say is that I've spoken to a lot of people who work on crypto in Africa, and a lot of the language is remarkably similar. So again, this idea of, oh, African states are failing, economies are failing, people can use crypto instead and kind of free themselves from the state, and they'll be able to then make it on their own. And that language is just strikingly similar to what Muhammad Yunus and others have been using for decades at this point. So I will say there's certainly a similarity there. And again, what I think it does is distract from questions of, well, why is there a problem with governance in X country? Why is there a problem with an economy? This notion that an individual can free themselves from the society around them, and that it essentially absolves governments from having to be responsible for their citizens, I think is really potentially dangerous.
Finally, Mara, really an interesting subject. Are you suggesting then that all this decentralized utopian libertarianism, the peer-to-peer revolution of Web3 and crypto, which is only going to, I mean, it seems to be coming back with AI, that ultimately doesn't work, and that the only way to really address these deeply rooted economic problems of injustice and inequality in developing countries needs to come through the state?
So I think that these kind of peer-to-peer solutions can be helpful on a day-to-day basis, and they can sometimes be transformative. So the fact that someone here can send $100 to someone in Sierra Leone and they can get it in minutes, and that can help that person pay, let's say, a healthcare bill, that can be transformative in the moment. And I just want to be clear, I'm not talking about a $100 loan, but $100 cash, right? That someone can use something like World Remit or another sort of platform and send money, let's say a Sierra Leonean family member here to someone in Sierra Leone, and can help them pay for their bill with a healthcare institution, can be transformative in the moment. What we have to look at, though, is why are they still having to pay a $100 healthcare bill? Often for things like, paracetamol or other very simple things that are very essential, but it should not necessarily cost $100, right? Why are there still these increasingly high individual costs that someone has to pay for? And so I think that it's a kind of yes and situation where remittances are incredibly helpful. There's a lot of evidence to show that remittances, for considering the African continent, are actually more helpful than institutionalized aid, that more money is sent from the US, for example, to Africa than from USAID to Africa, from individuals, from Sierra Leoneans living here to Sierra Leone. So I think there is potentially a really huge impact, but I think we have to be looking at why so much money needed, and what are the kind of long-term structural solutions. And I think it's both. I think that anyone who says it's one or the other, or anyone who gives a singular, simple solution is really missing a more complicated picture. And if people take nothing else from the book, I hope that's what they take.
Well, Mara, it's a real pleasure to talk. Congratulations on the new book. I think it's an important book. Really addresses so many of the issues that are surrounding not just the 90s, but today's world of AI and crypto. We are not able to live in the sky. The Seductive Promise of Microfinance by Mara Kardas-Nelson. It's in bookstores now. Everyone should read it. Mara, congratulations on the book. And I'd love to have you back on the show for another discussion on this subject. It's an important subject, which is certainly not going away. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Can I step on the sea?